The histories of old night tell us to fear men of stone and men of iron. They should have warned us, too, of the most terrible monsters of all, the Emperor's men of gold. These ominous words, attributed to a Terran minister in the 29th millennium, reflect the awe and dread inspired by the warriors now known as the Adeptus Custodes. Clad in resplendent gold and red, these transhuman guardians were crafted as the personal protectors of the Emperor of mankind. Their creation is a tale shrouded in myth and steeped in the dark genius of the Emperor's own design. In this historical account, we will chronicle the origins of the Custodian Guard in the brutal days of Terra's unification, examine the unique genetic and organizational formation of the Custodes, and follow their solemn journey through the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and the long millennia that followed. This is a story of the Emperor's firstborn warriors, wrought by his hand to guard the future of humanity. In the last days of Old Night, Terra was a shattered world, ruled by techno-barbarian warlords. From this anarchy rose the Emperor of mankind, determined to unify humanity's homeworld. To achieve this, the Emperor employed his unparalleled knowledge of genetic engineering, creating super soldiers to bring the warlords to heel. The first of these warriors were the Thunder Warriors, brutal, gene-forged fighters who won Terra in blood. Yet, even as the Thunder Legions conquered, the Emperor had already forged a superior breed of guardian. The Custodians, then called the Legio Custodes, or Custodian Guard, are described in many accounts as the Emperor's true firstborn, predating even the Thunder Warriors. They were his first genetically engineered, psycho-indoctrinated warriors, perfected weapons crafted by the Emperor's genius from the dread lore of the Dark Age of technology. Unlike the mass-produced Thunder Warriors, the Custodians were created individually, each one a work of genetic art designed for absolute loyalty and unmatched prowess. Even the earliest legends of the Unification Wars speak of the Emperor flanked by these golden giants. At the siege of the Black Manse of Nassau, one of the first techno-barbarian strongholds to face the Emperor, it is recorded that the warlord was confronted by the Lord of Lightning, the Emperor, attended by 4 giants of crimson and gold who demanded surrender. In subsequent campaigns, the numbers of these companions grew. Detailed archives from the wars recount that by the time of the assault on the Mollin-Sen Confederacy, one of the final great battles of unity, the Emperor led a companionship of 30 Custodians. Clad in ornate armor and armed with guardian spears, at the forefront of the fighting, one Custodian is even credited with taking the head of the tyrant prophet of the Confederacy in the decisive Battle of the Red Frost. These early exploits, half lost to myth, mark the public emergence of the Emperor's elite guard. The Adeptus Custodes were not merely an upgrade of the Thunder Warrior concept, nor a variant of the later Space Marines. They were something altogether more rarefied. Every aspect of the Custodians' creation was crafted directly by the Emperor's hand and will, using arcane lore and genetic craft beyond any other. Myth and secrecy surround their making. In later millennia, some Imperial savants theorized that the Custodians were to the Emperor what the Space Marines were to the Primarchs. That is, that the Emperor used his own genetic matrix as the template for the Custodes, thus ensuring their absolute loyalty through direct lineage. For a long time, this was hearsay, but recent sources firmly establish that the Custodes were created from the flesh and blood of the Emperor himself. They are literally the Emperor's own flesh, crafted sons. In a way, even the Primarchs were not. This singular origin is key to their purpose. The Custodian Guard were intended to be utterly incorruptible and unwavering, the living extension of the Emperor's own will. The Emperor's genecraft to create a Custodian was painstaking and individualized. where Astartes are created in batches through standardized gene seed implantation. Each custodian was built one at a time, sculpted with genetic alchemy and enhanced through decades of training. The criteria for a potential custodian initiate were astronomically strict. Imperial records note that the bioalchemical modifications required for the Legio Custodes could only be tolerated by the most exceptional candidates. Only a mere one in many thousands of potential candidates might prove suitable. For the simplest of the steps involved in the Custodes creation process, even among those rare few who were chosen, survival was not assured. Years upon years of rigorous psycho-conditioning, martial training, and further augmentation would winnow out any but the absolute most superior. The result of this arduous process produced warriors of nearly godlike quality. The Custodians are transhuman in the truest sense, stronger, faster, more acute of senses, and more resilient than even the doomed Thunder Warriors or the Space Marines who would follow them, and so far beyond the limits of an unaugmented human as to be almost godlike in comparison. In battle, only the Primarchs, the Emperor's demigod gene sons, and the Emperor himself could physically outmatch a Custodian. The Custodes embody the very peak of the Emperor's genetic science, the golden legion of demigods among men. Because of the inherently slow and careful creation of Custodians, their overall numbers were always extremely limited. It is believed that at no point in history were there ever more than 10,000 Custodians active at once. This proved true even in the Great Crusade's height, when the ranks of the Legio Custodes finally approached that figure, giving rise to their moniker, the 10,000. By contrast, the Legiones Astartes numbered hundreds of thousands across the galaxy. This stark difference was by design. The Emperor never intended the Custodes to be a conquering army or garrison force. They were his personal retinue and agents. Everything about the Custodes' origins and organization set them apart from the mass-produced Space Marines. As one account dryly notes, many uneducated observers assumed the Custodian Guard were just a more advanced type of Space Marine, an improved iteration. It could not be further from the truth. The Custodians were the Emperor's first creation, perfected before even the Primarchs and legions were conceived, and their loyalty was absolute in a way the Primarch's project could not ensure. No Custodian has ever turned traitor, and none ever will, a stark contrast to the fate of half the Emperor's gene-son Primarchs and their wayward legions. In terms of organization, the Custodes operated not as a traditional army but as an elite brotherhood. Each Custodian is an army unto himself, and often they act independently or in small cadres rather than large units. During the Unification era and Great Crusade, they were known simply as the Custodian Guard, or Legio Custodes, and they had their own ranks and titles, such as the Captain General who commands them, the most famous being Constantin Valdor in the Heresy era. They were sometimes referred to as the Companions, since a rotating cadre of Custodes always served literally at the Emperor's side, known later as the Heteron Guard in that role. Organizationally, they were outside the Imperial Army and Astartes command structure entirely. The Custodes answered only to the Emperor himself. Even after the Heresy, when they became the Adeptus Custodes within the reorganized Imperium, their authority was unique. They decide who may approach the Emperor's presence. It is often remarked that even mighty Space Marine chapter masters and inquisitors must kneel and seek permission from the Custodians to enter the Golden Throne's sanctum. Such is the reverence accorded to the Emperor's personal guard. Every Custodian is also a lord in his own right, by ancient law and by the weight of his deeds, and they carry titles like the 10,000, the Watchers of the Throne, the Golden Legion. They sparingly take to the field as a group. More often, individual Custodians act as emissaries, champions, or advisors when the Emperor's direct will needs to be imposed. In the days of the Great Crusade, they formed the upper stratum of the emperor's forces, often coordinating with the sister division of the imperial household known as the Sisters of Silence. Together, the Custodes and the Silent Sisters were called the Talons of the Emperor, the right hand and left hand of the Master of Mankind. While the Sisters of Silence were specialized in witch hunting and psychic nullification, the Custodians were the unmatched masters of war, diplomacy, and protection. In sum, the Adeptus Custodes were crafted to be the ultimate guardians and executors of the Emperor's will, a role and identity they have never relinquished. With Terra unified and the Emperor declared master of mankind, the next phase of his grand plan commenced. The Great Crusade, vast expeditionary fleets of space marines, imperial army regiments, mechanicum allies, and more fanned out from Terra to reunite the scattered human colony worlds under the Imperium. At the apex of this immense host stood the Emperor himself, and around him stood the Custodian Guard. The Custodians did not deploy as a conventional legion. Instead, they accompanied the Emperor as his personal retinue and Praetorian unit on key engagements. Wherever the Emperor went in battle, a contingent of Custodians went with him for protection. And when the Emperor treated with newly rediscovered cultures or primarchs, often a single majestic Custodian or a small honor guard would represent the Golden Throne, a living symbol of the Emperor's power and unity. Though few in number, the Custodes made a profound impact on the battlefields of the Great Crusade. Remembrancer texts from that era are filled with depictions of a glittering wedge of golden warriors cleaving through the fiercest foes at the Emperor's side. A famous example is the Battle of Gyros Thravian against the massive orc Wa of warboss Garkul Blackfang. There, the combined forces of several Space Marine legions, commanded by Horus, Rogel Dorn, and Mortarion, were on the brink of collapse under an endless green tide. In the decisive moment, the Emperor himself descended onto the battlefield from his warship Bucephalus, accompanied by 1,000 Custodian Guard, a rare concentration of their strength. The Emperor and his golden comrades struck like a thunderbolt at the heart of the horde. Imperial chronicles recount that within moments over 100,000 orcs lay dead, slaughtered by the Emperor's sword and the Custodians' blades, utterly shattering the alien army. In that legendary victory, only 3 Custodians fell, and such was the honor of their sacrifice that the Emperor had their names engraved on the inside of his own armor thereafter. This was but one battle among thousands. Yet it showcases the almost mythic reputation of the Custodes in combat. They were seemingly unstoppable, the embodiment of the Emperor's wrath. Despite their fearsome prowess, the Emperor used his Custodians sparingly. He valued them above all his other warriors, and while he was willing to expend countless servants, he was always hesitant to bleed his Praetorians. The lives of the Custodes were precious. Each loss was felt keenly by the Emperor. Thus, they were committed only to crucial missions, or the direst battlegrounds where the presence of the Master of Mankind demanded the utmost protection. Often, a dozen Space Marines might be sent where a single Custodian could suffice, or vice versa, depending on the task. The Custodians also undertook roles as emissaries of the Emperor's will. For instance, if a newly found human world needed to be brought into compliance by diplomacy, a lone Custodian, towering and resplendent, arriving bearing the Aquila standard, could overawe and persuade where armies might not. They were the Emperor's eyes, ears, and occasionally his scalpel in the field, operating with a freedom and trust that even primarchs respected. During the mid-years of the Crusade, the Custodes reached something of a peak in numbers and prominence. By the time of the triumphant Ullanor campaign, when the largest orc empire in the galaxy was annihilated, the Custodian Guard were at or near their full strength of 10,000 warriors. It was after Ulanor that the Emperor decided to withdraw from direct command of the crusade. In the grand victory celebration on Ulanor, he named War Master Horus to lead the ongoing crusade in his stead. The Emperor then departed to Terra, taking with him the greater part of the Custodian Guard. This moment, though few realized it at the time, was critical. The Emperor had a new priority, a secret project deep beneath the Imperial Palace that he believed would secure humanity's future forever. To guard this project and the master of mankind during his seclusion, the Custodes were indispensable. Back on Terra, the Custodian Guard assumed a dual charge. Outwardly, they became the protectors of the Imperial Palace, an aegis of gold never before seen in such concentration on Terra. In practice, much of the 10,000 moved into the colossal dungeons and vaults below the palace, where the Emperor labored on his great work, the Imperial Webway Project. The Emperor sought to create a stable human passage into the Webway, the ancient Eldar network of portals, hoping to liberate mankind from reliance on warp travel and the threat of chaos. This undertaking was highly secret, known only to the Emperor's innermost circle. The Custodes stood guard at the Webway Gate hidden in the Imperial dungeon, fully prepared to fight whatever horrors might emerge from the immaterial realms. For a time, all was quiet, and the Great Crusade continued under Horus's command. But soon, a calamity struck that would test the Custodes and all of humanity as never before. The Horus Heresy erupted suddenly, plunging the nascent Imperium into civil war. War Master Horus, the Emperor's favored Primarch, fell to chaos corruption and led fully half of the Legions Astartes in rebellion against the throne. Caught off guard by this galactic betrayal, the Emperor remained on Terra, focused on the Webway project even as the Imperium fractured. In the midst of this turmoil, Terra itself became a battleground on two fronts. Above, Horus marshaled his forces for a direct strike at the Imperial Palace. Below, the secret war in the Webway burst into crisis. Magnus, the Red's tragic attempt to warn the Emperor via sorcery, had shattered the wards protecting the Imperial Webway Gate, allowing hordes of warp-spawned daemons to pour into the tunnels beneath Terra. The Emperor was forced to personally enter the Webway, to stem the tide, and the brunt of that invisible war fell on the Custodian Guard. For years in subterranean darkness, the Custodes, alongside the Silent Sisters and Mechanicum Tagmata, fought an unimaginable conflict against the demonic legions in the Webway. The events of this war within the Webway remain one of the most closely guarded secrets in Imperial history. What is known from later accounts is that the fighting was ferocious and costly. Wave after wave of never-ending daemons assailed the narrow breaches held by the Emperor's guards. The Custodians, sworn to protect the Emperor, stood firm in those hellish halls, buying time with blood while the Emperor labored to seal the breach from within the Webway. They held back nightmares made flesh, suffering losses that would have broken any lesser force. It is said that the Emperor wept bitter tears for every Custodian who fell in those dark days beneath the palace. By their sacrifice, Terra did not immediately fall to chaos from within. Eventually, however, the Emperor was forced to abandon the Webway project when Horus's rebellion reached Terra's system. The Emperor pulled back from the Webway and ordered the portal to be sealed, even as daemons still clawed at its edges. The Webway Gate was shut, but at a tremendous cost. The Emperor's great hope for humanity's future was shattered, and the Custodian Guard was badly bloodied. Then came the Siege of Terra, the apocalyptic final act of the heresy. Horus's traitor legions, Titan legions, and warped allies encircled the Imperial Palace. The majority of the Custodes that remained, likely numbering only in the low thousands by this point due to Webway war losses, took up their blades and guardian spears to defend the Emperor on Terra's soil. They joined the loyalist space marines, such as the Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars, the Solar Auxilia, and other defenders in a last stand for the throne world. A contemporary account from the siege describes Constantine Valdor, the captain general of the Custodes, carving through traitor Astartes as though they were mere fodder, reaving through them as easily as an ordinary warrior might sweep aside lesser men. This was how the Legio Custodes fought, each custodian worth 100 lesser warriors. At the Eternity Gate of the Inner Palace, the Custodes and the Emperor's elite Legio Praetoria, the imperial fists under Rogel Dorn, stood unyielding, holding back endless waves of traitors and daemons. Not one step did the enemy take beyond the Emperor's defenders while they drew breath. However, the heresy's climax would test the Custodes' oath like no other moment. When Horus finally dared the Emperor to confront him in person, the Master of Mankind made the fateful decision to teleport onto Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, to end the war in one stroke. It is said, the Emperor took only a small party with him, Primarchs Sanguinius and Rogel Dorn, and a handful of others. Some sources imply Constantine Valdor and a few Custodes were initially part of this teleport assault. If so, they became separated from the Emperor in the chaos of that daemon-infested ship. In Valdor's case, lore suggests he was trapped in a warp-induced nightmare and was unable to reach the Emperor before the final confrontation. Thus, when the Emperor faced Horus, the arch-traitor, it was without any of his custodian guard by his side, a rare and tragic circumstance. In the battle that followed, Sanguinius was slain, Horus was obliterated, and the Emperor was mortally wounded. The Emperor's broken body was rescued and brought back to the palace by Rogel Dorn. In that heartbreaking moment, the Custodians' greatest duty, to preserve the life of the Emperor, had failed. They had protected him for centuries, through uncounted battles, and against impossible odds. But in the end, the Emperor still fell, in body, if not spirit, because of Horus's treachery. When the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne, sustained in eternal life in death, the Custodians were struck with profound sorrow and guilt. These proud warriors, each a paragon, realized that for all their victories, they could not prevent the one wound that changed the fate of the galaxy. In the immediate aftermath of the heresy, the Custodian Guard gathered around the Golden Throne, rededicating themselves with silent grief. They cast off their war banner cloaks of triumph and donned the color of mourning. For after the end of the Horus Heresy and the enthronement of the Emperor, the Custodes were said to have changed the color of their cloaks from red to black to symbolize the darkness that had fallen over their order. In these midnight black habiliments, the warriors of the 10,000 swore an oath that they would never again leave the Emperor's side. The Emperor had given everything for humanity. Now, in vigil and shame, his Custodians would give all they had to guard what remained of him. In the reorganization of the Imperium after the heresy, the Adeptus Custodes underwent a change of role and a measure of reclusion. Robut Guilliman, the new Lord Commander and architect of the Imperium's recovery, issued the Edict of Restraint regarding the Custodes. He decreed that the Adeptus Custodes were not to act as a normal fighting force outside Terra, except in gravest need. Their primary duty was the defense of the Emperor's person and his palace. Obeying this order, and indeed following their own inclination after the catastrophe of Horus's rebellion, the Custodians withdrew from matters of galactic war and imperial politics. Since the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne, the Adeptus Custodes have taken a more limited role as protectors of the imperial palace. As ordered by Robut Guilliman during his reorganization of the Imperium, from that point on, they would be seen only rarely by outsiders. They ceased calling themselves the Legio Custodes and formally adopted the title Adeptus Custodes, acknowledging their place in the Adeptus Terra, the imperial bureaucracy, while maintaining complete autonomy in practice. Within the imperial palace, the 10,000 became an almost monastic brotherhood of wardens. They maintained constant guard over the Eternity Gate, the entrance to the Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor's throne resides, and all the palace's approaches. They honed their skills relentlessly, training endlessly in the blood arts. One notable practice was the continued tradition of the blood games, as described in certain accounts, like the short story Blood Games by Dan Abnett. In these exercises, custodians would play the role of would-be assassins or infiltrators to test the palace's security, attempting to breach the defenses and even approach the Golden Throne undetected. These war games were no mere drills. They were deadly serious, for the Custodes understood that the Emperor's safety was paramount, and any weakness in the defense had to be revealed by them before a real enemy could exploit it. Through such constant vigilance, the Adeptus Custodes kept the imperial palace virtually inviolate for centuries on end. For nearly 10,000 years, the Custodians never again deployed in force beyond Terra. They stood watch through the darkest times of the Imperium, an ever-present but seldom seen line of last defense. Millennia passed, during which outsiders whispered that the Custodes had become nothing more than ceremonial guards, but this was far from true. They were active in subtle ways. For example, during the Age of Apostasy in M36, when the insane tyrant Goj Vandire paralyzed Terra and the ecclesiarchy with his corruption, it was the Adeptus Custodes who intervened to end the nightmare. The Custodians strode into the ecclesiarchal palace amidst the siege by Vandire's forces. They bore with them the truth of the Emperor's will. According to later recountings, the Custodes escorted a group of rebel Adepta Sororitas, the so-called Brides of the Emperor, leader Alicia Dominica, into the Emperor's throne room. What transpired inside is unknown, but when Dominica emerged, she carried the absolute certainty of the Emperor's condemnation of Vandire. The Sororitas turned on Vandire and executed him, ending his blasphemous reign. The Custodians then quietly returned to their own silent guard. This episode demonstrated that, even in times of dire internal crisis, the Custodes would act, but only in the Emperor's name and only to protect the Imperium from the gravest of threats to the Golden Throne's authority. As the millennia wore on, the burden of their eternal duty did not lighten. The Custodians felt deeply the weight of their failure during the heresy, referring to themselves as the eyes of the Emperor that never blink again. They continued to wear their somber black for long ages, a silent testament to grief and penitence. And yet, they never abandoned hope entirely. They maintained the imperial palace as a fortress second to none, and each custodian spent long years studying, training, and perfecting his skills in war and statecraft. Unlike space marines, whose lifespans are long but not immortal, the Adeptus Custodes are effectively ageless as long as they sustain themselves with the Emperor's technologies and perhaps his blessing. Thus, some of the same individuals who knelt before the Emperor's shattered body after the siege of Terra remained alive and vigilant millennia later, still keeping the faith and the watch. In the 41st millennium, events have conspired to draw the Adeptus Custodes out of their seclusion. A new catastrophic era known as the Era Indomitus, following the appearance of the galactic Great Rift, has dawned. The Primarch Robut Gaemon was resurrected and returned to Terra, finding the Custodians still at their posts. It was Guilliman's own coming that finally eased the burden of shame the Custodes carried, seeing the Imperium in desperate need, and at the direct behest of the reborn Lord Commander, the Custodes have once again taken to the field. By late M41, with the reappearance of Robut Gaemon, the Custodes abandoned their shrouds of shame and were seen again wearing their traditional red garments and power armor. The 10,000 marched forth to war, not in exile from their duty, but to fulfill it in a galaxy gone mad. They fought in the Thorian Crusade on Luna, battling daemons to secure Guilliman's path, and joined the Indomitus Crusade to bring light to worlds long lost. Even beyond Terra, when they act, They do so only to serve the Emperor's will, striking down threats to the Imperium that none but they could judge or overcome. In this new age of darkness and war, the Emperor's golden Praetorians have demonstrated that they are not simply relics of a bygone age. They are a living weapon of the throne, still as vital as ever. Through all of this vast span of history, one thing has remained constant: the character and creed of the Adeptus Custodes. These warriors are utterly dedicated to the Emperor. They were made for that very purpose and know no other truth. Their loyalty has never wavered, and their vigilance has never faltered. The Custodians have a saying, an axiom of duty that encapsulates their eternal service. Only in death does duty end. For 10,000 years, they have proven the truth of those words. The creation of the Adeptus Custodes was the Emperor's declaration that he would never be without protection, that the master of mankind would have angels of death by his side at all times. And indeed, from the battlefields of unity to the dark throne room of the 41st millennium, the Custodes stand shining and unyielding. They are the Emperor's last line, the Golden Legion, the 10,000, the watchful, immortal sentinels of humanity's future. In a universe of unending war and untold horrors, the Adeptus Custodes endure as a stern, solemn reminder of the Emperor's vision, a time when humanity would stand protected and uncorrupted, watched over by warriors for whom no sacrifice is too great, and no duty too small, in the service of the Golden Throne. Only in death does their duty end, and until that end comes, they shall not falter.